All right, everyone. Well, it's Healthcare Unfiltered. It's an exciting show today because I get to talk to some folks who've been on the show before. So always grateful because it means I have not messed up yet, that they're willing to come back. And a newbie who's coming on Healthcare Unfiltered for the first time. I'm also excited because the topic actually is really, I think, of interest, albeit I think it's fair to say it's somewhat controversial from what I have learned through covering this topic over the past several years right now. So, welcome guys to the show. I want to start with a round of introductions as to who you are, and one of you has to tell us how you all got together, like how what because everybody in a different location of the country, probably in a different. One of you I heard is an engineer, like what the hell? So, Nick, you start. Tell us who you are, and then Adrian, and then Dave, and then one of you tell us how you got together and became collaborators.
All right. My name is Nick Norwitz. I My background is a PhD in human metabolism. It's actually where I met Adrian. We were doing our PhDs together at Oxford. Um, I am currently a fourth year medical student at Harvard. By the time this podcast airs, I'll be a couple weeks out from graduation. And I got interested in this cholesterol science when I went low carb keto for inflammatory bowel disease. And despite recovering my health, I found that my cholesterol, my LDL in particular, jumped from about 90 to well over 300. And the way I had actually designed my initial ketogenic diet was very Mediterranean-esque. So not much red meat, not much dairy or saturated fat, like lots of leafy greens, fish, and nevertheless, my LDL went from like 90 to over 300. And I found this very curious. And now at the time, this was 2019, there wasn't much literature out there. So I started digging. I did what any PhD student or medical student would do. You go to PubMed, and there was nothing on PubMed, like people like me. So then I went off of PubMed and I started poking around the corners of the internet and I came across some crazy engineer named Dave Feldman, and that'll be my transition to pass it off to my good friend Dave.
Dave.
Yes, I'm the crazy engineer question. I got obsessed with it, and yeah, Nick. It's interesting because Nick was not just a lean mass hyper responder. The When putting this together, um, sorry, there was a the we released the paper yesterday, and even when turning off notifications, there's just been so many things popping up on screens all over the place. I know, Nick, you've been dealing with this as well. It's interesting because it makes it even difficult unless you be like lock out all the screens. Anyway, let me restart again.
Hey, it's good to be in demand.
This has definitely been a game-changing explosion. So,
I think we've all been up since like 3 a.m. replying to things. My
yes.
girlfriend she's on night shift. She has some time off. We're going on a walk, and I was trying to keep it in, but like internally, my heart is pounding. Like I'm away. I've never been so anxious being away from my phone. There's so much going on right now. It's
Right.
crazy, dude. And it's just been a big build up to this moment. So,
It it makes for a great contrast though. So to go back to me in the beginning, I was just trying to shake trees. I was trying to get people interested. Chatty, I know that you and I were chatting about this because you were there fairly early on. I was just trying to get lipidologists, cardiologists, like a certain cardiologist we hosted together a couple times, just to try to get people interested in studying this population. So yeah, what happened to me is I ended up in this space because I went on a low carb diet myself. I saw my LDL go up. I became obsessed with
Why
this
did you go on low carb diet?
because I was developing diabetes. I was pre-diabetic for 2 years and I wanted to stop that. But the trade-off of being high LDL and I die of a heart attack much sooner didn't seem that attractive to me. But then I found that it did, in fact, coincide with what I work on in engineering called networks. And that's what got me fascinated and obsessed with it. And I started doing a number of N of one experiments, presenting on it more and more. And then in time, identified this phenotype, lean mass hyperresponders, which arguably the three of us are at least LMHRs or near LMHRs. And where I was going was Nick is the most LMHR of us, I guess you could say, because his LDL is really through the roof.
Got it.
And then, yeah, that kind of, I think identifying the phenotype became really important because that past that point, it became easier to network. We were all getting a lot more interested. And that's where I started connecting with Nick. And then Nick connected us. He says, you've got to connect with Adrian. He's
With
not only my
Adrian.
really good
So
friend, But yes, he's the math guy. But go ahead.
Adrian, you're the math guy, apparently.
Apparently, I am based in Mexico City. As Nick already mentioned, we met at Oxford. I heard of Dave Feldman way before he heard of me. I give him credit for making me buy lots of white bread, because the first time I heard about the LMHR phenotype, I remember thinking, I can test this for myself. I am lean, I am insulin sensitive, I follow a low carb diet, and I have access to many of these tools. So it definitely captured my attention, and I focused then on my PhD. And then one morning, one Saturday, Nick set up a Zoom call that was my entry into the LMHR research I mean, this came with the cholesterol code survey.
But Adrian,
Data
Adrian,
was-
you all have mentioned LMHR several times. I'm going to assume there are some of my listeners who've never heard of LMHR. So you guys, tell me what LMHR is, Adrian, for folks who are hearing this term for the first time.
Sure. I mean, the term, it's an acronym for lean mass hyperresponder. And what I think Dave was trying to capture when he coined that term was referring or alluding that some lean people have a very large response when they restrict carbohydrates, specifically a response in LDL, but also in other lipids. So the LMHR lipid triad is characterized by very high LDL, high or unusually high HDL, and very low triglycerides. And this is a lipid triad that was rare until, or perhaps overlooked until not too long ago. I like to point out when this comes up that a couple of years ago, when we looked how many people in NHANES data met or presented this lipid triad, out of every possible lipid panel we found, which was, I think if I remember correctly, 90,000 lipid panels, only 3 of them had these characteristic high LDL, high HDL, low triglycerides. Actually, 2 times I've had to call a private lab because they think there's something wrong with their methods. And this is a triad that people were not used to see.
So Nick, these are people who have high LDL, high HDL, which was part of cholesterol, low triglycerides, but this only happens to these people if they go on keto diet. Is that where you see this?
Yes, I think to provide even more framework and relevancy to your general listener, I think all 4 of us here would probably agree ketogenic diets are becoming more popular for a wide variety of medical conditions. Some of these are more proven, like epilepsy, than others, but clinicians are experimenting for using ketogenic diets for inflammatory bowel disease, other autoimmune inflammatory conditions, and neurological mental health conditions. The use cases are expanding. So there's a lot of interest in ketogenic diets, as there should be, but there's kind of a boogeyman and an obstacle to clinical implementation, which is this cholesterol question. Now, the fact of the matter is, just to keep this practical, most people who go low carb or keto do not see increases in LDL and the associated biomarker ApoB. That's actually a minority phenomenon. But the question still arises, why does some people see an increase? And prior to Dave's characterization of lean mass hyperresponders, people used to think, and many people still do think, oh, it's just genetics or it's just the saturated fat. And we find is that's actually not the case. So Adrian did one brilliant led one brilliant study we published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition last year, where we took all the low-carb diet trials that were randomized controlled trials and said, what predicts increases in LDL? We found saturated fat had a pretty minor effect, but what the dominant effect was how lean someone is. So the leaner people tended to have the increase in LDL. In fact, if you look at the meta-analyses for people with overweight or obesity, there's no increase in LDL. In fact, it tends to be a decrease. It's only that leaner group that sees an increase in a dose response manner. So the leaner you are, the higher LDL goes. Now, this is practically important because it means that patients using keto for weight loss or type 2 diabetes are unlikely to see the increase in LDL. And technically and scientifically fascinating because if you presume an increase in LDL is a bad, unhealthy response, then why are the lean, healthy people seeing the bad response?
Right.
It's bizarre, right? And then to Adrian's point about this lipid triad, the lean mass hyperresponders are defined not just by the increase in LDL and the high LDL, but also the coexistence, the co-occurrence of also high HDL and low triglycerides.
Yeah.
And it's this union of three markers together that defines lean mass hyperresponders, although there's no criteria for leanness. The term lean comes from the association that, like, it's almost like a party trick. If any of the three of us saw a lipid panel and saw someone had this union of three markers, we could guess basically what their BMI was or within a range.
And for context, the LDL is the bad cholesterol that we talk about, and the HDL is the good cholesterol, just for general listeners, right?
Yeah, quote unquote. Yeah.
Okay,
That's
quote
what
unquote.
it's referred to as.
So Dave, both Adrian and Nick are saying that you labeled this phenomena as low lean mass hyperresponders. Are you the one who created that name? Does this name exist before Dave Feldman?
It did not exist before me. I will say though, I credit quote hyper responder to, I'm not sure which it was. It was either Peter Attia or Thomas Dayspring, but it was a blog post when I was just reaching for any information to, describe what I was going through with my LDL going through the roof after going on a ketogenic diet. And because of that, I wanted to make that part of the name, since this hyper response of high LDL going up was meaningful. But adding lean mass to what Nick was just saying was observational. I was getting labs that were coming in when I had the cholesterolcode.com blog, which was kind of my workbook for these experiments that I was doing. More and more people were networking, but when they would send it in, that pattern, it was just, frankly, just simple pattern recognition, along with sort of a lot of how my blood work was kind of opening up what was then the early days of the lipid energy model. But that said, I will say, without these two guys on here right now, the term lean mass hyperresponder would have taken a lot more time to get outside of the low carb community, because right now it's in the literature, because I'm, co-authoring with them on now, I want to say 11 papers or 12 papers. What are we up to now?
Yeah.
Something double it is.
So go ahead, Adrian, and then I want to just level set so we can move on. But go ahead, Adrian, you had a comment.
No, I mean, this made me think. I've always wanted to ask Dave, and I will profit from the opportunity. If you had to name it differently, once again, which name would you pick today for the phenotype?
Yeah, I get this a lot. It's so funny because I feel like Nick and I have had this discussion many times before. It would be great if there was a different kind of name. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Nick, I think you even alluded to it in one of your publications that I wasn't a co-author on, but that was more clinical based, that there may be a different name. But the irony is, it's so too late now. Like, it's become so much a part of the zeitgeist. And it's even for people who are big detractors, they're even using it a lot more. So I don't know.
So let's take a use case or like a scenario. I'm an individual. I decide to go on a keto diet because I have IBD, I have prediabetes, or I just hear it's the newest and the hippest thing in life right now. So I'm going to do keto diet. Some percentage of these people who do keto diet, some of them, you said, Nick, you said earlier, not all of them, obviously. Some of these people, they do keto diet, they lose weight, and they're lean, but their LDL sky high, HDL sky high, triglyceride go down. So is the fear is that you're reducing the weight, but you're increasing your risk of heart disease because the LDL is going up? Like, summarize the controversy for me. I mean, is this an observation that has any clinical sequelae?
Yeah, I think it's a rock and a hard place scenario, as you described it, that somebody might experience benefits, be that remission of some condition. Or, I mean, people don't have to lose weight to become a lean mass hyperresponder. A lot of people start off as lean, but because you brought that up, I think we've seen cases. Adrian's a clinician in the room, so he can confirm, for himself, but where somebody starts with obesity, say their BMI is 35, and they start losing weight, they improve their metabolic disease, and then their LDL stays pretty low until they get to the lean range. Then they go from BMI 35 to 30, LDL stays low, and they hit that 25 range, and their LDL takes a hairpin turn. So maybe they lose 100 pounds and improve the metabolic health, but then their LDL goes through the roof. What do you do with that? Rock on a hard place.
Right.
If you assume the LDL is increasing the cardiovascular risk.
Got it. Adrian, what's the percent of people who do get keto? Two questions for you. Percent of people do keto diet and they become lean mass hyper responders. On number two, do you see lean mass hyper responders in the absence of keto diet? Is this phenomena only occurs if I do keto diet?
I'll start with the second question because he's the only one I have an answer for. But yes, the answer is yes. Actually, in the study Nick already alluded to, we tested if people who were on a weight loss journey, most people who were on a weight loss journey but weren't restricting carbohydrates, they presented this phenotype, and the answer was no. This was specific for carbohydrate restriction. And as for the percentage of people who develop this phenotype, we would love to have funding for answering properly that question. We have this thing called the gym hypothesis, which is basically betting how many people you could turn into an LMHR. Because, again, what I'm going to say next is just a guess. We believe it's most of them, or at least I believe it's most of them. I think that the phenotype is a response of something that likely was normal physiology until not so long ago. And therefore, I would expect most lean people who are insulin sensitive will develop an LMHR or LMHR-like phenotype if they restrict carbohydrates and or if they increase their physical activity. The exact percentage, I do not know, but it does seem to be, my bet is that it would be high, and it does seem, and it is specific of restricting carbohydrates in people who are insulin sensitive and lean. I want to touch back or elaborate a little bit on the point Nick was making earlier on, yes, I get to see people who start, you could say, slightly overweight or slightly obese with lots of insulin resistance, adopt a ketogenic diet, they lose weight, they improve their insulin sensitivity, and it's not like something magical happens when they, the morning they wake up with a BMI below 25. When they approach BMIs around 26, I would even say 27, 25, 24, they start their LDL starts going up way before, way more than what it used to see when they started restricting carbohydrates or when they changed their diet. So yes, it does seem that when their body becomes more insulin sensitive, their LDL response changes. I have seen that multiple times.
So Dave, you saw this, you realized this, you've connected with people. What is the question that you were seeking to answer and you decided to say, you know what, we need to do research for this? Obviously, the phenomena exists. You've seen it. You've met people who had it. Adrian saw it in clinic with people and things of that nature. We don't know how often it happens. I got that. What is the research question that you wanted an answer for?
Well, it's been kind of my opening slide of a number of my presentations of the last few years. It's really two questions. So question one is the mechanistic one, which we haven't gotten into here yet, which is the reason why. And I think we've advanced so much more on establishing that the lipid energy model does seem to have a lot of legs under it so far. That mechanistic one is very interesting, but it can be looked at separate from the question of risk, which is, are lean mass hyperresponders at a population level at a higher risk, given quite literally their cut point is a 200 LDL cholesterol or higher? Because present day science would say, present day clinical practice would say that they are, and that they should take steps to lower their LDL because they are severe high risk. Therefore, the second question is that risk question. And that's has taken a lot more work to get the
Why is
answer.
it important though? Tell me, why is it important versus, okay, the LDL is high, take a bit of Lipitor and call it a day.
Well, the most obvious one is one, maybe not the most obvious one, the one that we focus on a lot in the documentary that I appreciate is that a number of folks have found efficacy for medical issues that they're dealing with through the ketogenic diet. Many who've gotten like a new lease on life, who, for example, have worked out their bipolar or their epilepsy or ulcerative colitis is another good example. And while it may be that there are other ways by which they could treat it beyond the ketogenic diet, if the ketogenic diet is working so well for them, in spite of, for example, not having any medication, of course, they would be very interested to know if the only thing that changed in a meaningful way to consider for risk is their LDL. Are they at high risk if they're otherwise metabolically healthy? And I feel like that's exactly why it's an important question to get an answer to.
So the research question is, if you are lean mass hyperresponder, are you at increased risk of developing heart disease, like heart attacks and specifically more coronary artery disease, right?
Yes. Yep.
And the reason, Nick, we're thinking about this, or Adrian, is because the high LDL, which we've all have learned in school, that high LDL causes heart disease. So you're questioning whether this applies to these individuals. Okay. So what trial did you design to answer this question?
Well, Dave was the one that was
I
present
can
at the
jump in. I
design
didn't want to
phase,
take it.
so in fairness, pass it
Yeah,
back to
I
him.
didn't want to take up all the time, but I'll just say that, yeah, the shortened version is we wanted to do what's known as a longitudinal study, where we would be looking at participants with 2 points in time with high resolution CT angiography. So our research partner was the Lundquist Institute, and this being led by Dr. Matthew Budoff, who has enormous experience in this space, especially with imaging. And what we did is we worked it out to where all 100 participants would be flown there to the Lundquist Institute to get their first scan. And then a year later, from whenever they got their first scan, they would get a second scan. So 100 baseline scans, 100 follow-up scans, all of them a year later. And then what we were the most interested in, the endpoint of interest was non-calcified plaque volume progression against especially LDL cholesterol. In the time that we were developing this study, though, it's worth emphasizing, I'm sure you're familiar with this, Chatty, that a lot of lipidology, and for that matter, cardiology, has gotten a lot more interested in ApoB in particular. So while we wanted to maintain that major endpoint of interest, we knew ApoB would be of special relevance because there's been a lot less interest even in pursuing LDL cholesterol. And so we had them both covered. We discussed those metrics in detail with the final published paper.
Adrian, was there a lot of challenges in getting funding for the study? Was this funded through philanthropy, research, self-funded? Like, how difficult was to fund this trial?
Back to Dave.
Yeah, I was knocking on doors for 2 years trying to get it from the quote unquote normal sources. I really thought, I think Chatty, you and I had actually chatted about this at the time.
Yeah.
Because I really thought that there would be cardiologists who do this for research purposes, that I could just get interested. And basically the common answer I'd get is, you're going to need to just be the one who writes the check. And I was like, well, I can't write checks for hundreds of thousands of dollars. So ultimately I founded the Citizen Science Foundation in 2019. This is again after 2 years of failing to get the study going, and just raised it direct from the low carb community, and other people were interested in getting the science done.
And how were the patients found, Nick? I mean, like, was it like, you just like post on social media in hospitals? Like, how were you able to recruit these 100 patients?
Yeah, well, I mean, the really remarkable thing about what Dave did, just kind of taking it back to the origins. I believe the blog post you put up was in 2017, right, Dave? Lean mass hyperresponders?
Yep.
Where, like any good scientist, he just kind of made this observation that leaner people tended to have this triad. And so he put this idea out there, and then it was really just like oh, that's me, oh, that's me, oh, that's me. The reason I'm responding to your question in this way is it's been remarkable the degree to which a community has arisen around this observation, to the point that what is there, like something like 13,000 in the lean mass hyperresponder Facebook group?
That's correct. We have a Facebook group with 13,000 right now. Yes.
Yeah. So
Unbelievable.
this was a phenotype, to Adrian's earlier point, that like it was there. People weren't just acknowledging what it was. And when it was called out, a community very quickly grew up around it. Now, it was an N equals 100 study. You can do the math. There's a Facebook group dedicated to it that has 13,000 people. It's not that hard to,
Right.
dig into that community. And I also want to emphasize just how remarkable these patients and participants are. I mean, in this study, over the year, the dropout rate was a flat 0%.
Amazing.
Which, I mean, it speaks to how much the people with this, the patients, really care about getting this research done.
Adrian, I know you have a comment. As you provide your comment, I also wanted to answer one important question, since you are a clinician and seeing patients. It goes without saying that the traditional teaching is that somebody with an LDL that high usually is offered statin therapy by many guidelines because that lower the risk of cardiovascular mortality and so on. So first, I know you put a raised hand to have a comment, so you could do that. And then next, were these patients not given statin, and were they explained that these are the guidelines, but it's your own risk? I mean, how was the consulting piece from a clinician perspective to somebody with that level of LDL? How did that take place?
What I wanted to comment is that Dave basically found a recipe for how to find people with very high LDL without other risk factors that are usually seen when people have high LDL. The most common form or cause for high LDL that you would observe today is people with insulin resistance. And Dave basically found how to find people who were only showing high LDL as cardiovascular risk factors. I mean, of course, this doesn't mean, and this is a point I wanted to make, that all people with an LMHR lipid triad have low cardiovascular risk, or that this is their only cardiovascular risk. You can have this lipid triad and still have high cardiovascular risk due to other factors. So, however, Dave identified the setting and the characteristics of people who would only have LDL as easily recognizable risk factor. Now, to go back to your question, sure, I think that clinicians' duty is to offer available and reasonable options. And this is beyond cardiovascular risk management. Every time I think an antibiotic could help one of my patients, I have to explain if there are alternatives, if there are potential adverse effects, what things we should be aware of. And the same is true for people with high cholesterol. And of course, all of them, I'm sure every single one of the participants who enrolled in this study were offered at some point a statin, and for whatever reason, they either refused it or stopped taking it. Many people don't tolerate statins. This has been, subject of debate. And it's perhaps important to say that something can be safe, but not easily tolerable or not tolerated by many. So many of them perhaps either refused or did not tolerate a statin. And this is true for any other treatment. Some of my patients refuse other forms of medication for whatever reason. And you will always find someone who doesn't want to, adhere to whatever the guideline said. So I think it's not, we shouldn't assume that because a guideline advises something and a clinician advises something, people will automatically say,
no, of
yes,
course not.
sign me up.
But these are patients that at least at some point were offered statin, but they declined because obviously the 100 patients that you enrolled, none of them was on statin, or some of them were on statin?
No.
Correct. That was actually part of the criteria, because if they had been on statins before, then they may have artificially lower LDL, hiding like genetic familial hypercholesterolemia.
Correct.
But they were self-selected to be unmedicated to that point.
Right. Yeah.
It wasn't a randomized.
It wasn't like, don't take statin. It was somebody who wasn't taking statin, so you actually can enroll in the trial. All right. So how long did it take you, Dave, to enroll these 100 patients? And there's a rumor that the trial, there's a publication that came out of the study.
Yeah, I can't wait to talk about that rumor.
Yep.
First of all, the length it's important for people to know that we raised the money, we have Lundquist run the study. And by that, I mean, while we can kind of put up the Facebook posts and the Twitter posts and everything else that sends people over to then contact Lundquist, they're the ones that actually handle the real recruitment. They have to, for example, have their staff screen and so on and so forth. Appropriately, we should be separated from that. That way, they're an independent research body that's accomplishing
Got
that.
it.
I think all in all, it ended up taking something in the neighborhood of around 13 months to recruit
It's pretty
everybody.
good. That's very good, actually. 13 months, 100 patients. That's really good.
It is the biggest obstacle that a lot of people would probably be surprised to know wasn't finding people who fit the criteria. It's that people often don't keep their older medical blood work. So they had to prove to us with the actual lab test that they had before going on a ketogenic diet that they had lower LDL before. So we needed the last test that they had before then adopting the diet. And we also needed to see their present day lipids. And so unfortunately, there were a bunch of people who were saying, look, I know for sure that I was lower than what it was
Hmm.
before. It's just that I'm no longer in
Right.
contact with my doctor. I can't get this from their office, things along those lines. That actually was one of the biggest reasons a
Yeah.
lot of this fell off. So it was very difficult. And yes, the rumors are true. Just yesterday, this little ditty came out.
So yesterday, for those who are listening, would be April 7th because we're airing this not April 8th. So April 7, 2025.
Yes, and I just have to say I'm still beside myself that it's really happened. And to what we were alluding to earlier, I mean, quite literally as we were starting this, I had I wish I was recording my screen. I had three different things pop up, and I was like, oh my gosh, and it took me a moment to just get back to this screen that we had. Nick, I want to give a special shout out to Nick because he's been on a media firestorm trying to get the paper known also by lots of media outlets and has been doing just a killer job on that. But I kind of feel like we should pass the ball over to Adrian, who really did a lot of the heavy lifting on this paper. Um, do you want to go ahead and tell us, Adrian,
Yeah.
how it turned
So
out?
Adrian, where was it published? And tell us what the results of the paper are.
Sure, this was published in one of the journals of the American College of Cardiology in JACC Advances. That's the name of the journal. And the results I mean, when one is drafting a title, is hoping two things: that the title refers what the paper is about, and that it invites people to read a paper. So what we found was that among LMHRs, among those LMHRs who show plaque progression, their plaque progression is not explained by ApoB. The only thing that explained how much plaque progressed after 1 year in people with this phenotype was how much plaque there was in the first place, which, to be honest, and I understand, sounds like we're saying it's not ApoB, but we're not saying what is driving plaque progression. And it sounds like an incomplete answer. And that's a fair point. We're simply saying, or the data we showed so far is simply saying, yeah, some of them progressed, but ApoB does not explain this progression. However, in our behalf, I would say that the ApoB question was so important that it deserved its own paper. I mean, I totally get how some people would say, hey, this is incomplete, show what does explain plaque progression. But for obvious reasons, ApoB required so many different ways of testing and required lots of analysis that it kind of deserved its own paper. We are working currently on trying to explain what, besides pre-existing plaque, explained plaque progression in those participants who showed plaque progression. However, the thing we can say so far, which is a big thing to say, all things considered, even when it's an incomplete answer, is that no, despite being the most famous usual suspect, ApoB did not explain plaque progression among those participants who showed plaque progression. So that's my, in a nutshell,
So
summary.
what we're saying, the high level of LDL, just to again bring it down a bit more simpler, what the paper suggests that the high level of LDL in those who are lean mass hyperresponders does not predict plaque progression,
Correct.
which is
That's
really
correct.
completely contrary to common belief, right?
Sure.
Because we all think LDL, bad cholesterol, this causes this. I have a feeling that Dave had an intuition that this will be the results. He just sought to prove that. Were you guys surprised by this, Nick and Adrian?
I
To be
mean,
honest,
go
go
ahead.
ahead, Nick.
Nick, go and then Adrian.
I mean, it's one of those things, okay, like Adrian's a clinician, a medical student, I'm not a clinician, but any clinician can tell you, like, you have a clinical intuition after seeing enough patients with a particular pattern. So while we didn't have the data, it was just like, we've seen so many lean mass hyperresponders who seem to be doing pretty well, including with cardiovascular imaging, that we were probably leaning more towards the possibility that this was a low risk group than your average clinician would, but the data need to be collected. So we had no idea. And to Dave's point, this was independently conducted from us. There's no way we're like, we can bias the results of these scans. And so this just confirmed
Right.
what I think we probably would have guessed if we were each betting, but we had no way of knowing. Now, to Dave's earlier point, just to reinforce, there are kind of like two questions here. There's the mechanistic and there's the risk. The lipid energy model, based on how we understand it, basically this lipid triad, we haven't said why the LDL goes high. Basically, we see it as a result of an adaptive response to fuel demands when you're lean and low carb. Basically, when you're lean and low carb and burning lots of fat as fuel, LDL goes up as a marker, you could say a litmus test of burning more fat. Now, you could say that's natural and adaptive, and I think it probably is, but there's a difference between something being like adaptive and then it being safe long term. So there's a lot of examples in physiology where you can have, say, like a stress response. It's good. Like you want like an epinephrine burst, and cortisol is a great hormone. But you don't want it high all the time. So we didn't know if the mechanistic metabolic adaptive response to low carb where the LDL was high was associated with plaque progression or not. We had to do the study. And the data were what the data were.
Dave, how has been the response so far? Where people, you're getting a lot of notifications and things like that, where people, I mean, are they more skeptics, less skeptics? Congratulations. Like, give me a sense of the response you've been having over the past 24, 48 hours.
I mean, I I will say it's been humbling. I would say that there's been a lot of thanks coming toward our team. There's been a lot of thanks for, for the work from the get-go. There has been a number of people who have chimed in that this kind of confirmed what they thought it was going to be. There has, on the other end, there's been some people who I think have provided thoughtful pushback for what they think we could be doing better. Many of the things we've actually conceded in advance, but that we're happy to concede again. For example, I think it's fair to say, hey, it'd be great if we had even longer data, right? I have further things I'll want to qualify with that, but this was already anticipated to the extent to where I would want it myself, which is why I've already been in the process of trying to secure funding for an extension where we get 5-year. That said, there are a number of folks who are saying this is meaningless data. It actually doesn't give us anything useful at all to work with. And to that extent, I do want to have an answer that should be understood for everybody. We're not talking, I realize lean mass hyperresponders, just throwing out these numbers, say 200 milligrams per deciliter or higher, that's not just high. You don't go much further before you get into not only the top 1%, but even the top 10% of the top 1%. Our average LDL of 255 to what you just said earlier, Chatty, this is clinically indicated to, there doesn't need to be any other risk factor. The current guidelines would say you should be on the maximally tolerated dose statin right now, because that's where it's expected the evidence should lie. But to put it another way, and this is what I usually say to get everybody thinking, if you looked at our eligibility criteria, if you looked at, yes, all of our participants have low cardiovascular risk factors, including other exclusion criteria, but do have sky high levels of LDL and ApoB, would a clinician right now say, oh, I think you're in good enough shape, I think you're fine. I don't think you need to do anything about your present LDL, even after I do some imaging and I find that, like say with the CAC or so forth, you're low risk. I think that I'm satisfied enough. I believe the current answer would be no. That would require a change. And so for those folks who would say these data are not useful in their current state, I would say, I think it's fine to have a nuanced response, but I think this actually is quite strong data. It's the kind of data we've never had before. Again, it's worth emphasizing that up until this point in time, virtually all of our data that shows an association of high LDL and ApoB with corresponding cardiovascular disease is usually in populations that either partially or exclusively look at those folks who have some impairment with their lipid metabolism or some genetic abnormality. This is the first time we've been able to prospectively follow people with sky high levels of the variable of interest, aside from all of these other confounders that they tend to cluster with.
Adrian, take that data that you guys just published and help me take it to the clinic. How are you going to apply? It may not have any application in clinic today, but are there immediate application to what you guys just reported on in your clinical practice today?
I would say yes. There are two things I would like to emphasize for clinicians out there. If anything, I hope these results or this data remind clinicians we need to look for cardiovascular disease drivers beyond the lipid panel. Whatever is driving plaque progression may not be in the lipid panel. So that's something that we could be reminded of from this data. But also, if you have someone with an LMHR phenotype or LMHR-like phenotype, get cardiac imaging. I mean, this is enough, I think, to already suggest that the best thing you can do to better identify the risk or to better characterize the risk profile of a patient with an LMHR-like phenotype is get at least a CAC score. And because that's you can get a better picture of how likely is that this patient will progress with very high ApoB level. So those two things I think are immediately clinically applicable. Look for other cardiovascular risk drivers beyond lipid panel, and if you have someone with these characteristics, get at least a CAC score.
I love that recommendation, actually. That's very good. Go ahead, Nick.
I think I can add to this from a clinical perspective as well. I might be a couple months away from graduating medical school, but I can speak from the position of a patient and a relatively well-informed patient, if I do say so myself. My LDL on last check, which was last week, was 566.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
This is crazy. You're like, are you a walking bomb, Nick?
No, it's so high that I don't tend to just go out of my way to disclose this to peers, but sometimes I'll bring it up. Like I'm walking across the campus, between Children's and the Brigham, and I'll be with an attending or a resident. Like we're talking about lipids, maybe on endocrine rotation. I'm like, hey, what's the highest lipid you've ever seen? Like the highest LDL? They're like, I don't know, 200. I'm like, I just saw a patient with like a 566. And they're like, I think you're probably mistaken. And then if I show them like a picture, it's a lab error. Like it's so high, it's seen as a joke, but it's not a joke. It is the phenotype of people like me, people in this study. And yeah, it's a difficult position to be in. As I say in a video I have coming out this Friday on transcytosis at the end, I'm like, look, I've disclosed my lipid panel. Some people say, our detractors like, oh, Nick is biased. He's just trying to like rationalize with these studies, how his keto diet is treating his IBD and that it's heart healthy. It's like, that's a hypothesis. Another hypothesis is that I have more skin in the game than anybody, and I can't afford to get this wrong because I won't just look like a goofball. I could kill myself. And I do not want to do that. So I have every reason to do this thoughtfully, diligently, and I'm not saying this is the right move for everybody else, but after deep thought, open-minded discussions with my clinician, my family, both my parents are clinicians, I'm unmedicated. And I'm unmedicated based on, let's say like clinical triage points, diagnostic principles that are represented in our study, getting cardiac imaging, monitoring with cardiac imaging. My arteries are clear. I've been on a ketogenic diet for 6 years with quite a lot of exposure over that time. I'll continue to monitor, but frankly, to Adrian's point earlier, when you discuss options with patients, as my doctors have discussed with me, there should be a full and complete disclosure of possible side effects, known and unknown. And when you have a young patient dealing with their options, do I want to be on a medication for life? Do I want to roll the dice with respect to my high cholesterol? Do I want to abandon a diet that is treating my inflammatory bowel disease and giving me a quality of life, allowing me to engage in life? It's not a simple answer. And so I guess all we're saying is we want more data that is pertinent to this
Right.
population, because you can talk about the guidelines all day, but the guidelines are only useful insofar as the evidence base upon which they're based is relevant to the population at hand. And this population has never been studied before. My last comment on this before I'll pass it back off to Adrian is I guess I'd summarize the guidelines jokingly, but also not jokingly. I'll quote the great what is it, Dr. Captain Barbosa. They're more like guidelines than actual rules. The guidelines aren't rules. They're guidelines.
Right.
And there's a clinical judgment to be made based on the unique individual in front of you.
Adrian, Nick
I just
shows up.
want,
No, hold on. Nick shows up to your clinic. You look at his labs. It's almost 600 LDL, 526, 536. Take me through what would you tell Adrian if he was your patient, and then you can tell me the comment you raised your hand for.
sure. I actually use Nick very frequently as an example because I would like to remind everyone that not every LMHR is Nick Norwitz. And Nick is a very special case because I have actually seen into his genome. The very first paper we wrote together involved that. So I know, I know I have an unusual amount of information about Nick Norwitz's health.
Oh boy,
He has had
that's dangerous, Nick.
more than one cardiac. I mean, he has genes tested, cardiac imaging tested, advanced lipid panels testing. So I think that it's fair to say that someone with Nick's age, health literacy, and metabolic risk markers and overall health risk markers won't have a meaningful increment in his cardiovascular risk despite his ApoB blood levels.
I just want to interject for one moment. I have to go on this tangent. I'm sorry, because it is relevant to the story, the arc of the story, which is how Adrian met me, which was my inflammatory bowel disease hit its worst right after moving to Oxford. So I'm by myself in a new country. My inflammatory, like, shit hits the ceiling, so to speak, pardon the pun. And I'm like in intensive care at the John Radcliffe Hospital within months of moving to Oxford. I had nobody there. And so there was like a moment, I mean, I kind of knew Adrian, but literally he became my healthcare proxy, like as soon as I moved there, because I needed somebody in the country. I knew nowhere else. So Adrian was spending time with me before I was keto in the hospital, taking care of me. Like he saw where I was at and he's seen where I've come. So, I mean, that's relevant to how we met, but I think it gives that like real human patient element, because if I didn't use a ketogenic diet, I probably wouldn't have ended up being able to go to medical school. I don't know where I would be.
Right.
But I just needed to introduce
I'm
that.
glad you did well. So Adrian, you had a comment earlier and I interrupted you because I was
Sure.
asking.
What I want to point out that we don't have 1.9 square meters of skin in the game, alluding to what Nick was saying before. We have 700 square meters of endothelium in the game. We have every reason to want better data on the real cardiovascular implications of a phenotype like this. And not only that, we are in contact with people who are also in very different parts of the spectrum of the LMHR phenotype. Some people in low carb communities dislike when I publicly say I prescribe statins every day when I show up to work, because many of the people I take care of have already had a heart attack. And the benefit risk ratio of a statin for someone like that is very different. So I don't think I tend to analyze everything case by case. And Nick Norwitz is a very particular case, and many of the people I serve are not Nick Norwitz. And this data is meaningful or useful for many parts of the spectrum.
Dave, what is next? What would be the next step? I mean, you've proven a theory. I know that you're not done, and you probably have another theory, wherever that is. What is next on the horizon? And you have been labeled by some people as you are an anti-statin guy. How did you handle the criticism? And is this a vindication of that criticism that you were given in the past?
I'm glad you brought that up, because right after this podcast, I'm going to have words with Adrian. This was just one too many times he's mentioned he prescribes statins every day. No, obviously, I've quite literally I've quite literally reposted Nick Norwitz explaining, in the context of this very story, that had he gotten a CT angiogram and his arteries weren't clear and he did have disease, he would have taken steps, including potentially taking on a statin. I know, Nick, you're totally down with me mentioning that.
It was a deal with my cardiologist to get the
Yeah.
CCTA. I said, I will tell you now prospectively if it comes back with positive plaque. First of all, I had already told Dave, like, look, whatever my scan is, I am enough of a prominent LMHR. Like, I will disclose what the scan is. Doesn't matter what the result is. A priori, I said I'd disclose the results. And to get the scan done, I said to my cardiologist, if there's plaque here, I'm telling you now, I will take pharmacotherapy. At this point, we didn't have these study results. I'm trying to figure out what's right for myself. I'm a young person. If the CCTA showed plaque, I said I go on pharmacotherapy and I disclose all of that. Turns out I had zero plaque, but didn't need to turn out that way.
And so I was mainly capitalizing on the joke in a sense, but chatty too. I do like whenever there's the opportunity to mention this, because you know this, I do my best to not be the clinician, to be the one person on a call like this where I'll let the two medical professionals talk about individual care. To me, that's the cart. The horse is whether or not LDL and ApoB will have a correlation to plaque presentation or plaque progression in this population. And our paper does speak to that. So at least with the time span that we have, the answer is no. There's just not a correlation there. However, present plaque, it does expand on existing data that was already there in other populations, that if you have plaque, it can be very predictive of future plaque progression. So the next step is yes, we're doing the extension. I think I mentioned that a little bit earlier. I'm pretty sure that I'll succeed at securing the funding and get that in place so that we can re-recruit a number of the participants. I doubt we'll get 100% this time, because it will have been much longer. And we'd have to start in October of next year. So we do still have a little bit of time. But then we would get a 5-year differential between the first scan and the last scan, which I think would be super powerful data. I'm very much looking forward to that. Outside of that, I've been holding charity conferences and more fundraising for a second study. The Triad study is what I've codenamed it. I'm hoping I can get 100 participants again, but this time with an additional 100 controls. And if so, the one thing that I've been advertising and trying to raise this money is saying it'll be more permissive criteria than this first time around. After all, we're pretty confident we can now get through IRB with a little bit more of a permissive criteria. For example, they may have lower relative HDL, still say maybe 50 or higher, and higher triglycerides, say maybe 100 milligrams per deciliter or lower. So it's more generalizable. and potentially with maybe one or more risk factors, maybe in a soft fashion, such as like being a previous smoker for X number of years, things along those lines, will be a bit more possible. Lastly, the mechanistic question is still hot in our minds. The catch is, unfortunately, it costs more money to get to the mechanistic data than it does to get to the risk
You've
data.
got two PhDs, they can figure it out.
Yeah,
PhDs get paid?
No, PhDs, they're just like the science. They don't get paid.
Yeah,
yeah.
but
Well,
do the tracer studies. I mean, like an N equals 30 tracer study would be at least 8 times the budget for this N equals 100 prospective study we just did. We got a quote,
Yeah.
at least 8 times.
Wow.
and frankly, the second question, getting back to the two questions, the question of risk is the one people are more interested in. So it's also
Right.
harder to fundraise
Right.
when you're saying we're going to get this interesting esoteric mechanistic question on the gym hypothesis and lipid physiology. It's not as big of a deal as, hey, can people be walking around with a 400, 500, 600 LDL and actually be at a low risk for cardiovascular disease? Is that even possible?
Are
So
you getting closer with the cardiology community? Do you think that the cardiology community is not too Dave Feldman friendly?
this is where I'm going to pass a little bit of credit off to my colleagues. I think that I'm going to say the quiet part out loud, which is that while my story is very interesting to non-medical professionals, it is helpful when, say, a Nick Norwitz is, and he'll say this himself, and the signature is is Harvard, right? Coming from a Harvard .edu email, that's going to get opened. So the knocking on doors and the writing emails from 2017 to 2019, I've seen Nick do in 2 months a lot of things that it took me 2 years to try to do. And for what it's worth, whatever gets the job done, whatever gets whatever helps us advance this research, at the end of the day, it's for the people we're featuring in the Cholesterol Code movie film that we have coming out. Those stories,
Yeah,
they
well,
they
hold
will
on. You
touch
can't
you.
just tell me there's a movie coming out and just pass by. Come on, I'm a
Oh,
freaking podcaster here. You can't just like
sure.
throw this. What kind of movie are we talking about? Jeez.
Well, this was the best part, was while the study findings were being revealed, for the last 2 years, there were cameras there. A very amazing team called Wide Eye Productions and a director, Jen Eisenhart, was arranging with me to capture what was happening in real time as it happened, along with us doing a number of interviews. I've interviewed a whole bunch of people like Robin Dobbins, like Johnny Coughlin, and many others who benefit uniquely from the ketogenic diet in the way that I was talking about before, where they had special efficacy, but they themselves are lean mass hyperresponders. They saw the huge increase in LDL. So what did they do? And so we got their individual stories while interweaving the major through line of the study and these results, even all the way up until when we had these results in hand, at least in the back end. And yeah, now it's been put together, and I'm happy to say these two fine gentlemen are very prominently in the movie as well. And the story behind it, I think, is actually really fascinating. The documentary itself, Chatty, when you come here,
When is
we'll
it coming
we'll
out, by the way?
we'll screen it. Well, they're in negotiations right now. There's a whole PR team behind it, and the target is this fall.
And did you mention healthcare unfiltered anywhere in the movie?
I'm not sure if I did.
Dave Feldman. I was one of the first podcasters that got you out there. I can't believe that. And I mean, I'm more than happy to try to cast to play your role, or you can just stick with George Clooney. That's totally fine. But I was hoping I'll be like in the cast. No, congratulations. This is really amazing. I think there's a lot here because I followed this story for years, and I actually realized that there's a lot of pluses, minuses, everything. But I give you credit for all the perseverance, tenacity, and actually, more importantly, I think you sought to answer a question in a scientific manner. There's no perfect science. I mean, of course, I'm sure in the paper you had to have a paragraph into the shortcomings and things like that. Otherwise, no reviewer will accept it. And I'm happy that I heard about next steps. Are there anything that I forgot to mention or you'd like to share with people? We'll go around the table, just anything you want to share.
I
Maybe
think
Adrian,
it's
you
a
start.
relevant point.
Yeah,
Oh,
go
go
ahead,
ahead.
Nick. No, go ahead, Nick.
I think a point I really want to emphasize, so it's not lost, and I think the movie does a beautiful job of highlighting this. Everybody should go to the newsletter for the movie, by the way, and sign up for that. But I saw it; it is beautiful, but that's not what I want to say. What I want to say is there are strong opinions around these data and this research because people really care. And some people are going to give you an extreme point of view that this like overthrows the lipid heart hypothesis. Other people are going to give you an extreme point of view that this is nothing. This does not overthrow the lipid heart hypothesis, but it has exposed a major blind spot. And I think that's what I'd summarize as like a takeaway from the academic perspective. We're not overthrowing decades of research, but we are exposing a major blind spot. And that's how science evolves. You take a model and you find where it has deficits, and then you evolve it. So I think these are pivotal data. This is a really important paper. It doesn't overturn everything else, but it points us in a direction where we can better our understanding of human physiology, cardiovascular health, and truly help people.
Adrian, final thoughts.
What I would say is that playing devil's advocate against, the relevance of this paper, what I would say is, sure, nothing has changed. One of the main conclusions is that the oldest truth in medicine still holds up. Everybody's different. Not all LMHRs are the same. And let's be mindful that what works for person A may not work as well for person B. And hopefully these exciting results will help continue these questions and get better data. If in 5 years we find out, or we can characterize better how to help those who are progressing fast, of course, that's going to be terrific news, regardless of what that answer is. And in 5 years, then we say that, okay, we have a better way of identifying who will be who. That will be very good as well. We will learn something. And in the end, the best advice hasn't changed. Check your own health with your own doctor. Remember, everyone is different. And don't get frustrated or don't get into social media fights because what's working for somebody else isn't working for you, or vice versa. So this is a happy moment because these results hopefully will help people and will help continue asking these questions.
Dave, final thoughts.
I'll be a devil's advocate to my good colleagues. Devil's advocate. I think actually a lot has changed. A lot can have changed without everything changing. I think a lot's changed. I think that we're right now sitting on some of the best data. I mean, regardless of even getting into the baselines, just the fact that there was not a correlation at these magnitudes cannot be understated. The magnitudes are tremendous. We're getting into realms that were never considered before or even achievable in this kind of setting. And it's why, like I said with the triad study, that we may actually be able to get through IRB much faster. Is because now it's going to be possible to be considered as such that at a population level, the group level, that this may in fact be low risk. But I will capitalize on not only what Adrian's saying, but what I think we're all saying, and this isn't medical advice. This, I think, is just common sense. Your individual circumstances are your own. So no one's going to take your own health into account like you are. And yes, any cohort of 100 people randomly determined, randomly chosen, could be at a low risk at a population level, but at an individual level, you can eventually find that a number of them will have plaque, and imaging is just one of the best ways to not only find it, but to do something about it. So that's just my 2 cents. I'm so thankful, Chatty, that we got to jump on your show in particular the day after this dropped, because I've had so many great conversations with you. In fact, I think to your point from earlier, I think that I want to say we've been on maybe 4 or 5 times.
Yeah, we have been, and
there's
I'd
a good
say,
historical record of
yeah,
our journey.
no, I mean, we actually had several podcasts, including a couple of debates with other people, but congratulations. And I actually literally had you on the show when you just launched the trial. If you remember, it was a 101. We talked about the study. So congrats on the paper, congrats on the results. Looking forward to learning more, and congrats on the movie. Looking forward to watching it and reviewing it. And I don't know. I think Healthcare Unfiltered should have gotten a plug in the movie, but I'll try to go over this. Thanks, guys. Congratulations.
Thank you for having us on, Chad.